Usually when we sit down to talk about a writer for one of these deep dives, we have a pretty clear, stable picture of who they are in our heads. It's almost like a caricature.
It is. It's a shorthand.
Right. If I say Hemingway, you immediately picture the beard, the shotgun, the bullfights, the terse sentences.
Yeah.
If I say Jane Austen, you see the bonnet, the quill, the drawing room manners. We like to put our creative geniuses in boxes.
We do. It makes them easier to understand. We like categories. We like to know that this person does this thing. It simplifies everything.
Exactly. But today we are looking at a figure who is so chaotic, so prolific, and so utterly contradictory that he feels less like a real human being and more like a fictional character he might have written himself. He explodes every box you try to put him in.
That is actually the perfect way to frame it. It is a fascinating case study in how we categorize or often miscategorize creativity. Because if I say the name John Anthony Burgess Wilson to you, you might pause.
I would, yeah.
You might blink and wonder if I'm talking about a local politician. But if I shorten it to the name the world knows him by Anthony Burgess, what is the very first image that hits your brain?
Oh, it's immediate. It's visceral. It's
Yeah.
a bowler hat. It's a glass of milk. It's Malcolm McDowell with his eyes clamped open. It's A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
Specifically for me, and probably for 99% of the people listening, it's the Stanley Kubrick movie.
The movie.
You just can't escape that imagery. It's iconic.
It is iconic, and that is the tragedy and the triumph of Anthony Burgess. He is forever tethered to that one dystopian novella. It's the one-hit wonder syndrome, but applied to a literary giant who wrote dozens of books.
Exactly.
And our mission for this deep dive is to completely shatter that narrow view. We need to move past the droogs and the milk bars because the man behind the orange was a true polymath.
And I want to pause on that word polymath. We throw that around a lot for anyone who, say, writes code and also bakes sourdough bread. But what are we actually talking about here with Burgess? What's the scale?
We aren't talking about hobbies. We are talking about a man who composed over 250 musical works.
Wow.
Symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music. He didn't just dabble. He considered himself a professional composer who just happened to write novels to pay the bills.
250 works. I mean, that is a career in itself. That's a life's work for most people.
It was his primary passion. And on top of that, he spoke multiple languages fluently, including Malay and Russian. He was the guy Hollywood called when they needed to invent a prehistoric language for a blockbuster movie.
Seriously.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps most famously, and this is the hook that usually gets people interested in the biography, he wrote a massive chunk of his literary output in a frenzy because he was told by a doctor that he had exactly 1 year to live.
The death sentence that launched 1,000 ships, or in this case, dozens of novels. It sounds like a movie plot. It sounds too perfect to be true.
It does, doesn't it? And as we go through the source material today, which covers a comprehensive biographical overview, his literary critiques, his musical archives, and accounts of his time in the colonial service, you're going to see that Burgess lived his life at this intersection of high art, profound personal tragedy, and what biographers call mythomania.
Mythomania. That is a great word.
Yeah.
So are we talking about a compulsion to lie or just to embellish? What does that really mean?
It's a compulsion to tell stories. I think that's the best way to put it. Burgess loved to narrate his own life, and sometimes the line between what really happened in objective reality and what he said happened gets a little blurry. He is the ultimate unreliable narrator of his own biography.
I love a reliable, unreliable narrator, especially when it's the author himself. It adds a layer of mystery to everything we're about to discuss. So let's look at the stack of sources we have today. We're pulling from a massive collection of data points to build this profile.
And we're going to find some incredible nuggets in there. We'll unpack the brain tumor incident that kickstarted his career. We'll look at the lost 21st chapter of his most famous book, which changes the entire meaning of the story, by the way. And we'll look at his secret life as a serious classical composer.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the beginning. And for Burgess, the beginning wasn't just humble. It was genuinely traumatic. He was born in 1917 in Manchester.
Harper Hay, specifically,
Good.
a suburb of Manchester.
Right. Harper Hay, Catholic background, lower middle class. His parents were shopkeepers selling tobacco and alcohol, which, considering the Great Depression was looming in the distance, was actually a pretty recession-proof business to be in.
True. People always need a drink and a smoke, especially when things go south.
But the tragedy strikes almost immediately in his life. He's just a baby.
It does. To understand Burgess's psychology, the darkness and the isolation you see in his later books, you have to look at the year 1918. He is just a baby. The Spanish flu pandemic is sweeping the globe. And this isn't just a bad flu season. This is a biblical event killing millions.
Right.
And in the span of just 4 days, Burgess loses his mother, Elizabeth, and his sister, Muriel.
4 days. He's a year old. He's essentially alone in the house with a grieving father. He wouldn't even have memories of them, really. Not conscious ones?
No conscious memories. But that dynamic with the father, Joseph Wilson, sets the tone for his entire childhood. You might expect a father in that situation to cling to the only surviving child, to become overprotective, but Burgess grew up believing that his father actually resented him.
Resented him for surviving.
Yes. It's a terrible burden for a child to carry survivor's guilt by proxy. The idea that I am here breathing and eating, but the people he really loved are gone, and every time he looks at me, he sees their absence.
God, that's heavy.
It is. Burgess described his childhood as incredibly solitary. He used this heartbreaking phrase in his memoirs. He said he was either distractedly persecuted or ignored.
Distractedly persecuted. That is such a specific and painful phrasing. It implies he wasn't even worth a focused effort of bullying. It was just casual, indifferent cruelty.
Exactly. It wasn't a grand vendetta. It was just that he didn't fit. He talks about being targeted by ragged boys in gangs who would pounce on him. Now, you have to picture Manchester in the 1920s. It's industrial, it's rough, it's smoky.
Right.
And here is Burgess. He's well-dressed because his father had a bit of money from the shop, and crucially, he could read.
So he's the smart kid in the velvet suit in a gritty industrial town. He's walking around with a target on his back.
He was a target. He went to a Catholic elementary school where illiteracy was still common, but Burgess was advanced. He was different. And in that rough and tumble world of 1920s, Manchester, being the other, being the smart one, the clean one, is dangerous.
It's interesting because you can already see the seeds of his later work there. The isolated intellectual facing off against mindless, violent gangs. That's the DNA of A Clockwork Orange right there, isn't it? The fear of the pack.
It connects directly to the themes we see later in his dystopian fiction. But this isolation also drove him inward. When you don't have friends and you feel unwanted at home, you build your own worlds. You retreat into your mind. And for Burgess, that inner world eventually became music.
But not immediately, right? I read in the notes that he was actually indifferent to music until he had this specific, almost spiritual moment with a home-built radio.
This is the psychedelic moment, as he called it. He's a teenager, tinkering with a crystal radio set, very DIY, very much the tech of the time. And suddenly, through the static and the crackle, he hears a flute solo. It's Claude Debussy's Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faun.
Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Now, for those who haven't heard it, we should explain, this isn't a catchy pop song. This isn't a marching band tune.
No, it's revolutionary. It's dreamy, drifting, impressionist music. It doesn't have a heartbeat, it floats. And Burgess described it as sinuous, exotic, erotic. He was spellbound.
Wow.
He said it was a recognition of verbally inexpressible spiritual realities. It wasn't just a song to him. It was a doorway out of Manchester. It was proof that a beautiful, magical world existed somewhere else.
And so naturally he decides, I'm going to be a composer.
Yeah.
He wants to live in that world.
He announces this to his family, and the reaction is, well, it's brutally practical. They told him there's no money in it.
Of course.
Which, to be fair to his father and stepmother, was generally true for a kid from Harpurhey. Classical composition was a rich man's game. But Burgess was stubborn. He taught himself the piano at 14. He didn't have formal lessons. He just sat down and figured it out.
That is the mark of an obsessive mind. But here is the twist that changes his life trajectory. He applies to university, specifically the Victoria University of Manchester, wanting to study music. This is his dream, this is his escape plan, and it gets rejected.
And he gets rejected for the most bureaucratic reason possible. Poor grades in physics.
Physics. I have to ask, what does physics have to do with composing a symphony? I mean, I know sound is waves, but still.
Well, the music department at that time required a physics qualification, presumably for the acoustic side of things, understanding how sound waves travel and interact. Burgess didn't have the grades, so his path to being a professional musician was blocked by a high school report card.
That is such a sliding doors moment.
Right.
If he passes physics, maybe he becomes a famous conductor, and we never get Anthony Burgess the novelist,
Yeah.
so he pivots.
He pivots to English language and literature. And he does well, but even there you see this flash of his personality. He graduates with a Bachelor of Arts, upper second-class honors. But there's a famous anecdote about one of his term papers being graded by the famous historian A.J.P. Taylor.
Oh, I saw this quote in research. It is absolutely brutal.
Taylor wrote on his paper, Bright ideas insufficient to conceal lack of knowledge.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That is a burn that lingers for a lifetime.
It is, but it also captures Burgess perfectly. He was always overflowing with bright ideas. Sometimes the scholarly discipline, the dry fact-checking, came second to the flash of brilliance.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the key takeaway from this period is his self-perception. Even while studying English, even while writing essays on Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, he viewed himself as a composer who was forced to write words. He never let go of that identity. He was a musician in exile in the land of literature.
So we have a frustrated musician studying English, living in the shadow of a tragic childhood. And then history intervenes. World War II breaks out. Burgess joins the military. Now, usually, this is the part of the biography where we talk about heroism and camaraderie and bands of brothers. But Burgess, he wasn't exactly Captain America, was he?
Far from it. He served in the Royal Army Medical Corps and the Army Educational Corps. But by all accounts, he was deeply unpopular with his peers and his superiors.
Why? Was he just arrogant? Was he aloof?
He was a prankster, but in a way that feels a bit malicious, or at least deeply antisocial. For example, he once polished a corridor floor, specifically to make people slip and fall.
That's not a playful prank. That's setting a trap. That's something a cartoon villain does.
Exactly. He also knocked the cap off a corporal. He had this deep-seated loathing of authority. He saw the military as this machine that crushed individuality, which is a very consistent theme for him. He hated being a number. He hated being told what to do by people he considered intellectually inferior.
That makes perfect sense for the man who would write A Clockwork Orange. The anti-authoritarian streak runs deep. He's basically acting out.
He is. He even got pursued by the military police for desertion at one point because he overstayed his leave to be with his future wife, Lynn. And later, when he was stationed in Gibraltar, he was actually arrested in a neighboring Spanish town for insulting General Franco.
Insulting a fascist dictator while on a day trip in Spain. You have to give him credit for that one. That takes nerve, or maybe just a lack of impulse control.
It shows his reckless streak. But his time in Gibraltar is actually very important for his development. He worked as a training college lecturer, but because he had this incredible flair for languages, he got pulled into intelligence work.
Ah, so this is where that comes in.
Yeah, he participated in debriefing Dutch expatriates and free French refugees.
This is the polymath showing up again. He wasn't just learning textbook French or Spanish. He was dealing with real people in a war zone, trying to extract information.
Exactly. He was absorbing the nuances of language under pressure. And he was also involved in a program called the British Way and Purpose. It was designed to introduce soldiers to the peacetime socialism that was expected in post-war Britain. The idea was to prepare them for the welfare state.
Which is interesting because Burgess himself wasn't exactly a socialist, was he?
No, far from it. He described himself later as a Catholic Jacobite imperial monarchist with anarchist tendencies.
That is a word salad of political ideologies. Jacobite imperial monarchist. What does that even mean in the 20th century?
Basically, he was a traditionalist who hated the modern bureaucratic state. He romanticized the old ways, kings and queens, but he also hated rules, hence the anarchism. He thought socialism was ridiculous, though he did support socialized medicine, surprisingly.
Yeah.
But being forced to teach this socialist curriculum gave him a very close look at state-sponsored ideology. He saw how the government tries to mold the minds of its citizens using pamphlets and lectures. Again, this fuels his later dystopian writing.
Now we have to talk about the darkest moment of this period. We mentioned his wife, Lynn. This is the event that truly shadows his life and his work. And warning to listeners, this is heavy.
Yes. It happened during the blackout in London. Burgess was stationed in Gibraltar, but Lynn was back in England. She was pregnant. During the blackout, she was robbed and brutally assaulted by 4 American deserters.
God.
It was horrific. And as a result of the trauma, she lost the child. To make matters worse, Burgess was denied leave to come home and see her. He was stuck in Gibraltar while his wife was going through this unimaginable physical and psychological trauma. He was completely helpless.
That helplessness must have been eating him alive. To know the person you love is suffering and you are stuck on a rock in the Mediterranean.
It was a defining trauma. Lynn eventually developed serious alcoholism, likely as a coping mechanism, and died of liver cirrhosis years later. But for Burgess, that violence, specifically the randomness of it, became the core of A Clockwork Orange.
Right.
It wasn't a calculated crime. It was 4 men attacking a woman in the dark just because they could.
It changes how you read the book, doesn't it?
Yeah, okay.
Because usually people think A Clockwork Orange is just about youth violence in the abstract. But for Burgess, Alex and his droogs weren't just abstract concepts. They were the monsters who hurt his wife.
And yet, what makes the book so complex and so disturbing is that Burgess turns the camera around. He doesn't just write a revenge fantasy where the bad guys get killed. He writes a book about the morality of free will.
Yes.
He asks, is it better to be a man who chooses to be bad than a machine that is forced to be good? He takes his personal pain and turns it into a philosophical inquiry about the state's role in controlling violence.
It's a staggering creative transmutation to take the worst thing that ever happened to your family and turn it into a debate on moral choice. Most people would just want revenge.
It is. And it explains the darkness at the heart of his work. It wasn't performative, it was personal. He was wrestling with his own demons on the page.
So after the war, Burgess moves into the next phase of his life. He joins the colonial service. This is the 1950s. He's teaching in Malaya, which is now Malaysia, and Brunei.
This was the era of the expatriate writer. Think Graham Greene or Somerset Maugham. The British Empire is winding down, but there are still Brits out there administering the colonies. Burgess wanted to be the true fictional expert on Malaya. He wrote what became known as the Malayan trilogy books, like Time for a Tiger.
And he wasn't just a tourist. He went all in on the culture. He didn't just hang out at the British club drinking gin and tonics.
No, he really didn't. He learned the language fluently, including the Jawi script, which is Malay written in Arabic characters. That is not easy to do.
Not at all.
He immersed himself. He even wrote a symphony, the Sinfoni Malayu. There's a great detail where, during a performance of this symphony, the audience actually shouted, Merdeka, which means independence.
He's writing music that gets the locals shouting for independence from the very empire he's serving. That is irony on a high level.
It is. He was very sympathetic to the local culture, often more so than to the British administration. But the crucial moment, the pivot point of his entire career, happens in 1959. He's in Brunei, he's teaching a history class, and suddenly he collapses.
Just drops to the floor.
Flat out. He's rushed to the hospital. He's flown back to London for neurological tests. And the diagnosis comes back. Inoperable brain tumor.
And the prognosis.
1 year to live, maybe less.
This is the legend, the death sentence catalyst.
It is. Burgess is sitting there thinking he has 12 months left on this earth. He has a wife, Lynn, who is struggling with alcoholism and has no income of her own. He is terrified that he's going to leave her penniless. So he makes a decision. He is going to write.
And write. And write.
He is going to write as fast as humanly possible to build up an estate for his widow.
It's the ultimate deadline.
Literally. He starts churning out novels at a breakneck pace. He writes, The Doctor is Sick. Inside Mr. Enderby, The Worm in the Ring. He is writing thousands of words a day, driven by the belief that the Reaper is standing right behind his chair. He's trying to outrun death with a typewriter.
But here's the twist. He doesn't die.
He does not. He lives for another 33 years.
So what happened? Was the diagnosis wrong? Or was there something else going on?
This is where we get into that mythomania we talked about. Later in life, Burgess claimed that there never was a tumor. He said he was driven out of the colonial service for political reasons.
Political reasons, like he was too radical.
He claimed he was supporting the revolutionary opposition party in Brunei. He even told a wild story that his wife Lynn had said something obscene to the Duke of Edinburgh during a royal visit, and the authorities used the tumor excuse to get rid of him quietly without a scandal.
Wait, he claimed his wife insulted the Duke of Edinburgh? That sounds very Burgess.
It does. It sounds like a scene from one of his books, but biographers tend to lean toward a more mundane explanation.
You choose.
Burgess was drinking heavily. The climate in Southeast Asia was oppressive. He was overworked and disappointed professionally. It's very likely the collapse was due to the effects of long-term alcohol abuse and exhaustion. And the brain tumor was either a misdiagnosis or a dramatic exaggeration that Burgess embraced because it gave him an excuse to retire and write full-time.
That makes sense. I have a brain tumor is a much better exit strategy than I'm burnt out and drinking too much.
Exactly. And whether it was a medical error, a political conspiracy, or a massive hangover, the result is the same. It unlocked him. It turned him from a teacher who wrote on the weekends into a literary machine.
Precisely. That dying year created the work ethic that defined the rest of his life. He never really stopped writing as if he was running out of time.
And in the midst of this frenzy, he writes the book, A Clockwork Orange.
1962. And from what I understand, he wrote it incredibly fast.
He wrote it in just 3 weeks.
3 weeks? That is insane. I struggled to write an email in 3 weeks.
He needed the money. He later called it a jeu d'esprit, A playful witticism, something knocked off quickly. He actually spent a lot of his later life resenting the fact that this little book overshadowed his massive, serious novels like Earthly Powers.
Absolutely.
He felt like a chef who spends days cooking a banquet, but everyone only wants to talk about the sandwich he made in 5 minutes.
It's the classic creator's curse. The thing you spent the least time on becomes the thing everyone loves. But we need to get into the controversy of the book itself, specifically the ending. Because the book I read in college might not be the book someone else read, depending on where they bought it.
This is a critical point. The original manuscript had 21 chapters. Burgess was very specific about this number. 21 was the age of majority, the age you became an adult in the UK at that time. The structure of the book was symbolic.
So what happens in chapter 21, the missing chapter?
In chapter 21, Alex, the narrator, the violent Gug, grows up. It's a few years later. He meets an old friend who has settled down, and Alex realizes that violence is boring. It's childish. He voluntarily decides to abandon his life of crime and thinks about having a son of his own. It is a redemption arc. It suggests that moral growth is possible.
But that's not the ending in the movie. And I recall reading the American version of the book, and that chapter wasn't there.
No. When the book was sold to a U.S. publisher, the editors thought the ending was too soft, too British. They wanted the gritty, unrepentant ending where Alex reverts to his old self. So they cut chapter 21.
And Burgess just let them.
He needed the money. He was still in that I'm gonna die any minute mindset, so he agreed.
So the American version of the book ends with chapter 20.
Which ends with Alex basically saying, I was cured all right, implying he's going back to ultra-violence with the state's blessing. It's a cynical, cyclical ending.
Yeah.
And crucially, Stanley Kubrick based his film on the American edition.
So the movie, The Cultural Phenomenon, tells a fundamentally different story than the one Burgess intended.
It changes the entire moral argument. Burgess wanted to say that people can grow out of evil, that maturity is the cure for youth violence. The movie and the U.S. book says that evil is a permanent state and that the only cure is state control, which is just another form of evil.
Which he hated.
He hated that his book was used to glorify violence. He felt the film made sex and violence look cool, which led to misunderstandings that pursued him until his death.
It's fascinating that he actually wrote a follow-up about this, right? A nonfiction analysis.
Yes, in 2019, they discovered a manuscript in his archives called The Clockwork Condition. It's a nonfiction philosophical sequel where he tries to analyze the condition of modern man and address the controversy. He never published it, but it shows how much this misunderstanding gnawed at him. He felt responsible for how the culture misinterpreted his work.
And we can't talk about Clockwork without talking about the language. Nadsat, this wasn't just gibberish he made up.
No, it's a brilliant invention. It's a teen slang based on Russian.
My Russian, of all languages.
Inspiration struck during a trip to Leningrad in 1961. He was relearning Russian and realized that merging it with English created a weird, alienating effect. But the purpose wasn't just to be clever. By using this made-up slang for the violent acts, he forces the reader to work to understand what is happening.
Can you give us an example for anyone who hasn't read it?
Sure. Instead of saying blood, he says krovy. Instead of head, he says Gulliver. Instead of good, he says horror show, from the Russian Kurosho. So when Alex describes beating someone, he's using these alien words. It creates a distance. You aren't just consuming violence, you are decoding it.
It's like a filter.
It is.
It makes you a participant in the decoding, which makes you complicit in a way. You're learning the language of the murderer.
Exactly. And he famously refused to include a glossary. He said he would resist to the limit any request for a glossary. He wanted you to be brainwashed by the language as you read it. He wanted you to learn it by context, the way a child learns a language.
But they put one in anyway eventually, right?
Of course. Publishers eventually added glossaries anyway, which annoyed him.
Okay, so that's the Clockwork Phenomenon. But, as we promised, we are moving beyond the orange.
Yeah.
Let's look at Burgess the polymath, because this guy was doing everything.
Polymath is the only word for it. Let's go back to the music. We mentioned the 250 works. This wasn't a hobby. He wrote a symphony for the University of Iowa. He wrote an operetta based on James Joyce's Ulysses called Blooms of Dublin.
And he even structured his novels musically. This is the part that blows my mind. How do you structure a book like a symphony?
This is where the expert in me gets excited. Take his novel, Napoleon Symphony. It is structured exactly like Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. The Eroica has 4 movements, each with a different tempo and mood. Burgess wrote the book in 4 sections to match those moods.
So if the music is fast and aggressive, the writing style changes to match.
Exactly. The prose itself changes. The sentences might get shorter, more staccato, and if the music is a slow funeral march, the prose becomes heavy and slow, more descriptive, more mournful. And in Mozart and the Wolfgang, he mirrors Mozartian composition.
So he's trying to make you hear the book.
He was trying to fuse the two art forms. He wanted the reader to hear the structure of the novel. He was pushing the boundaries of what a novel could even be.
And they're still finding this stuff. It's not like we know everything he wrote.
Correct. In 2023, they found a string quartet in his archives that nobody knew existed. It premiered that same year. He was composing right up until the end. Music was his first love and his last love.
Then there's the linguistics. We talked about Nadsat, but he also invented a language for a Hollywood blockbuster.
Quest for Fire, the 1981 movie about early humans. The director, Jean-Jacques Annaud, needed a language that sounded prehistoric but had structure. He didn't want the actors just grunting, and.
So he calls Burgess. That's amazing.
He calls Burgess. Burgess created Ulam. He combined roots from various ancient languages, Indo-European, Native American, to create something that sounded primitive but had a consistent grammar. So when the characters are speaking in the movie, they're actually speaking a functioning language.
That is some serious nerd cred.
And he translated huge works too, right?
Yes, he translated Cyrano de Bergerac and Carmen, but there was a bit of controversy about his linguistic skills. A biographer claimed that in a BBC documentary, Burgess was shown speaking Malay to locals, but they didn't understand him. The biographer used this to suggest Burgess was a fraud, that he faked his fluency.
Was he a fraud? That fits the mythomania idea.
Well, the director of the documentary actually came out and refuted this. He clarified that Burgess was speaking perfect Malay, but the waitresses he was talking to were ethnic Chinese who didn't speak Malay.
So it was a cultural misunderstanding.
It was a scene highlighting the ethnic divisions in Malaysia, not Burgess's incompetence. So the mythomania accusations sometimes went too far the other way.
It seems like controversy just followed him. And on the flip side of high art, he was writing screenplays for franchises.
He wrote Jesus of Nazareth, the famous miniseries, which is
Yeah.
very respectful and orthodox. But then he wrote a screenplay for James Bond, The Spy Who Loved Me.
No way. Burgess wrote Bond. He did. And it was wild. It featured a supervillain organization called CAOS, and the plot involved a plan to bomb the Sydney Opera House with surgically implanted bombs.
That sounds incredible. Why didn't they make it?
It was rejected as being a bit too outrageous. One critic described it as a medley of sadism and acupuncture. But, you know the massive submarine silo in the final movie? The one that swallows ships?
Yeah, the supertanker.
That idea survived from Burgess's script. So, a little bit of Burgess DNA is in the Bond franchise.
That is amazing. So we have the writer, the composer, the linguist. Now let's talk about the man himself in his later years.
Yeah.
Because he didn't stay in Manchester. He became a tax exile.
This was the 1960s and 70s. Britain had an incredibly high tax rate for high earners, up to 90%. Burgess, finally making money from his books and film rights, refused to pay it, so he left.
And he didn't just fly first class to a villa. He did it in a van.
A Bedford dormobile, basically a camper van.
Huh.
He toured Europe with his second wife, Liana. She drove, and he sat in the back writing novels on a typewriter.
That is a romantic image.
Sir.
The writer on a run, clacking away in the back of a van, traversing the Alps.
It sounds romantic, but the reality was chaotic. They lived in Malta for a while until the government confiscated his house.
Why? What did he do?
He gave a lecture that offended the Catholic priests there. Burgess had a knack for offending religious authorities. Then they moved to Italy, but they had to leave because of the mafia.
The mafia.
There were rumors of a plot to kidnap his son, Paolo Andrea, so they fled to Monaco, which was safe and tax-free.
We need to touch on his personal life here because it explains the chaotic movement. We mentioned his first wife, Lynn, died, but he remarried very quickly.
Very quickly. He married Liana, an Italian translator, just 6 months after Lynn died. But here's the soap opera twist. He had been having an affair with Liana while Lynn was still alive, and they already had a son, Paolo Andrea.
So he had a secret family.
He kept the affair and the child secret. Why? Because he didn't want to offend his cousin.
Who was his cousin? The Prime Minister?
The Catholic Bishop of Leeds.
Of course he was. You can't make this stuff up.
Burgess was terrified of the scandal, so he lived this double life until Lynn passed away. Then he married Liana and adopted his own biological son to legitimize him. It's like a plot from one of his novels, Catholic Guilt, Secrets, and Complex Family Dynamics.
He also seemed to have a knack for feuds. I read about a falling out with Graham Greene.
Oh, yes, Graham Greene, the titan of literature. They were neighbors in Antibes. But Green cut him off. Why? Because Burgess appeared on television.
That's it. Because he was on TV.
Green believed that appearing on talk shows was beneath the dignity of a writer. He thought a writer should be read, not seen. Burgess, who loved the spotlight and was a natural performer, did all the shows. Green thought it was vulgar and stopped talking to him.
That is such a specific, old-school literary beef. You're too famous, I can't talk to you.
It speaks to Burgess's character. He wasn't an elitist in that sense. He wanted to engage. He appeared on a show called After Dark discussing sex and divorce alongside Andrea Dworkin. He was fearless in that regard.
So we come to the end. The man who was supposed to die in 1959 makes it all the way to 1993.
He died of lung cancer in London, which is ironic because he wrote that he expected to die unmourned in the Mediterranean, but he came back to London in the end.
And he's buried in Monaco. And his epitaph. It's just two words. Abba.
Abba, Abba.
Yeah.
It's Aramaic for father, father.
Is that a religious plea?
It's a reference to Christ in Gethsemane praying to God. But in true Burgess fashion, it is also a literary reference. It's the title of his 22nd novel, which was about the death of the poet John Keats.
Ah, of course.
So even on his tombstone, he is blending the spiritual with the literary. He never turned it off.
That is perfect. It's the ultimate Burgess move.
So what does this all mean? We started by saying we wanted to move beyond the orange, and I think we have. We see a man who is driven by a desperate need to create, whether it was music, language, or stories.
A man who turned trauma into art and a medical death sentence into a 30-year career.
And here is where it gets really interesting to consider the legacy. Burgess wrote A Clockwork Orange in 3 weeks. He wrote symphonies that took years. He wrote epic biographies. And yet, the 3-week project is the one that defines him.
It raises a huge question. Do creators get to choose their legacy? Or does the audience decide what matters?
I think Burgess would have hated the answer, but the audience always decides. However, the beauty of a deep dive like this is that we can reopen the case. We can look at the rest of the iceberg.
Exactly. So here is my final thought for you listening. Don't just watch the Kubrick movie again. Go find earthly powers. Or, better yet, go online and search for his music. Listen to the Sinfonie Malaya or that string quartet. Hear the man as he wanted to be heard, as a composer.
Absolutely. There is a whole universe of Burgess out there waiting to be discovered. You just have to look past the bowler hat.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you in the next one.